Picture yourself the morning after the paperwork goes through. Not a vacation morning, not a celebration, an ordinary morning. The coffee is there, the house is quiet, and the provision you spent 6 months confirming, the one that made the exit possible, the one that made the numbers work, has done exactly what it promised to do. The door is open. You are through it. And somewhere underneath the relief, there is a question that the math never answered, that no spreadsheet can reach, that is sitting in that quiet kitchen waiting for you. Now what? Not what will I do with my time, not what will I do with the money. Who am I in this room? I want to make a pact with you. I'll tell you what I found on the other side of that door, honestly, without the version that makes it sound cleaner than it was. You tell me in the comments what you picture when you think about your first ordinary Tuesday in early retirement. Not the trip, the Tuesday. One thing you'll write down and actually sit with this week. I'm Ron Vickers. Subscribe and hit the bell. This channel is a community of people doing this honestly. What I'm about to share took me 2 years to work out, but the first thing I understood, the thing that arrived before anything else, was this. I found out there was a provision that would let me pull my retirement funds without penalty at 55. I spent 6 months figuring out how to use it. I spent the next year figuring out that nobody warns you what you're walking into. That is the truth I want to start with. Not a warning, not a discouragement. Just the honest account of a man who researched the numbers thoroughly, confirmed the provision applied to his situation, executed the exit on his own terms, and then stood on the other side of the door wondering why he felt like he'd forgotten how to be a person. I'm Ron Vickers. I spent 26 years in the United States Army as an infantry NCO. I retired from the Army at 44. 4 months later, I took a job as the Director of Emergency Management for Cumberland County, North Carolina, because I had no idea what to do with myself otherwise. I stayed in that role for 18 years. I retired from it at 62. This channel, Beyond the Grind, exists because of what the second retirement actually was. And I want to talk today about the thing that made it possible and the thing that made it hard, and why those two things are not the same conversation, even though most people treat them like they are. The provision is called the Rule of 55. I'm not going to explain it as financial guidance because that's not what I do here and it's not what this video is. What I will tell you is that it exists, and that if you separated from your employer at or after the age of 55, it may allow you to access certain retirement funds without the 10% early withdrawal penalty that most people assume applies until 62. I confirmed it applied to my situation. And I want to tell you what happened after I confirmed it, because that is the part nobody puts in the explanation. It was the kind of morning in late winter where the light comes in flat and gray, and the house is already awake before you are. Patty was in the kitchen. I was at the table with my coffee and my laptop, going through the specific mechanics of what leaving the county at 62 would actually look like. Not whether I wanted to leave. I had already worked that out. I mean the numbers. The pension from the Army, which I had been drawing since I was 44. The county retirement. The ability to access the 401k without penalty under the provision. I had been through the math more than once. I kept going through it again, not because I didn't trust the math, but because something in me was still waiting for the number that would tell me what the math couldn't answer. That number doesn't exist. I know that now. At the time, I kept looking for it anyway. Here's what I was really doing at that table. I was trying to use a financial calculation to answer a question that isn't financial. I was trying to get the spreadsheet to tell me that leaving was the right thing. And spreadsheets are very good at telling you whether something is sustainable. They are completely silent on whether it is the right thing. I had enough. I had known I had enough for 2 years before I filed the paperwork. What I didn't have was certainty about what I was walking into. And I thought, for longer than I should have, that if the numbers were right, the rest of it would be right too. How many of you are sitting somewhere in that same calculation right now? Not whether you can afford to leave. You've run those numbers. You've probably run them more than once the way I did. But whether the permission you're looking for is actually in those numbers, or whether it's somewhere else, somewhere the spreadsheet can't reach. How many of you have looked at the math and felt it click into place and then felt, underneath the relief, a question that didn't go away just because the math worked out? What am I walking into? Not financially, as a person, as someone who has organized 40 years of their life around being somewhere and doing something and mattering to other people in a way they could see and name. What happens to that part of it? That question is what this video is actually about. The rule of 55 is how I got to the door. What's on the other side of the door is a completely different subject, and I have not heard many honest conversations about what that subject actually contains. Here is the thing I discovered that I was not expecting. The provision protects your money. It does not protect your sense of who you are. Those are two completely different problems that happen to arrive at the same time. When I confirmed the provision applied and I started thinking seriously about leaving, I assumed that once the financial piece was settled, the hard part was done. The hard part was the math. The hard part was the timeline. The hard part was making sure we weren't making a mistake. Once I confirmed we weren't making a financial mistake, I assumed the rest of it would follow. What I did not understand, and I should have understood it because I had lived through one version of it before, was that the finances are the framework. The life you have to build inside the framework, that's a separate project entirely. And nobody hands you the plans. I had retired once before, I've mentioned this. I retired from the Army at 44. I was an infantry master sergeant for 26 years. The Army is not a job. I want to be precise about this. The Army is a total institution. It organizes your time, your schedule, your social world, your sense of rank and belonging and consequence, your understanding of what a day is for. When you leave the Army, you don't lose a job. You lose the complete architecture of your daily existence. I knew this. I had watched other NCOs go through it, and when it happened to me, I lasted 4 months before I took the county job, because I didn't know how to be in a room that didn't have a mission assigned to it. The county job was not a mistake. I want to be clear about that. 18 years. I built the emergency management department for a mid-sized county from the ground up. I managed my team through 2 major hurricanes. I trained a group of 12 people who I consider among the best professional work of my life. It was genuine work, and I am genuinely proud of it. But there was a moment, about 3 years before I filed the retirement paperwork, when I noticed the feeling had changed. Not the quality of the work. The quality of the work was still there. But underneath the work, the engine had changed. I had been running on mission. At some point, I started running on obligation. And I knew the difference. I had learned the difference in the Army, watching senior NCOs who had stayed past the point where the mission was still driving them. They were still functional. They were still meeting the standard. But something had gone out of it. I recognized that feeling when it arrived in me, because I had watched it arrive in other people, and I knew what it meant. It meant it was time. The new county administration had come in wanting to move in a different direction. They weren't wrong to want that. Organizations change. What they needed was different from what I specifically had to offer. I had seen this before too. The Army does it to you when your time is coming. They don't fire good NCOs. They just start assigning them to things that are slightly adjacent to where the real work is happening. Not as punishment, as management. I knew what the signal meant when I saw it at the county, and I respected it enough to start looking at the door. So I went looking for the door, and that is when I found the provision. There is a man I know from the Fort Liberty Transition Program. I volunteer there 2 mornings a week, sitting with recently separated soldiers, not as a counselor, but as someone who has been through it. And this man, I will call him Marcus, had separated at 56 after 28 years in the Army. He had the retirement. He had the VA benefits. He had done everything right. His wife told me later that the first week after he separated, he woke up at 5 in the morning every day and sat at the kitchen table and made a list of everything he needed to do. And when the list was done, he sat and looked at it and made another list. Because the lists were the only thing he knew how to do with a morning that didn't have a formation in it. Marcus was not struggling financially. Marcus was struggling with the specific vertigo that comes when the frame that organized your life for 28 years disappears, and the replacement frame has not yet arrived, and you are sitting at a kitchen table making lists because lists feel like something, and nothing feels like nothing, and nothing is what you have. I sat with Marcus on a Tuesday morning at Fort Liberty in a room with cheap folding chairs and a coffee urn that made coffee that was technically coffee, and we talked for 2 hours. And what came out of that conversation was not advice. I want to be precise about that. I don't give advice to those men. What I do is describe what it was like for me. And I described the 4 months after leaving the Army. I described the lists I made. I described the projects I completed and the hollowness underneath the completion. And Marcus looked at me and said, "So it's not just me." And I said, "It's not just you." And then we sat for a minute without saying anything. And that minute was more useful than anything I could have told him about strategy or planning or the 5 steps to a successful military transition. That is what I had found in 18 years at the county and 2 years into the second retirement. That the most useful thing I had was not expertise. It was the account. The specific, honest account of what it was actually like. Not smoothed over. Not reframed into a lesson. The actual sequence of events and feelings. Because when a man who is going through it hears the account from someone who has been through it, something releases in him. The isolation breaks. And the isolation, I have come to believe, is one of the hardest parts of this transition. Not the finances, not the schedule. The specific loneliness of thinking that what you are experiencing is a personal failure rather than a nearly universal condition. What I did not fully account for when I used the provision at 62 was this. Leaving a decade before the conventional retirement age means you are something that the culture does not have a clean name for. You are not retired in the way your parents were retired. You are not old enough for the social permission that comes with age. You are 55 or 58 or 62, and you have made a deliberate choice to step off the track that most of your peers are still on. And the culture around you has no ready category for what you are now. And that absence of category is harder than it sounds. At 65, a man who retires is fitting a recognizable social script. People understand it. They have a picture for it. At 55, a man who retires is doing something that requires more explanation than most people have patience for. Are you okay financially? Did something happen at work? Are you sure about this? I heard versions of all of those questions. And every version of them was, underneath the question, the same question. Why would you leave before you had to? And the honest answer, because the engine had changed, because I recognized the signal, because the provision existed and the math worked and there was no reason to stay, that was actually about the work rather than about not knowing what I would do without it. That answer required more honesty than most casual conversations could hold. So I stopped explaining, which created a different problem. My wife, Patty, retired from teaching about 2 years before I left the county. She taught elementary school for 31 years. She is the most accurate external observer of both of my retirements, and she does not soften her observations for my comfort. In the first months after I left the county, she watched me apply to retirement the same approach I had applied to every other challenge in my life. I built a structure. Wake at 5:30 because I have never once in my adult life slept past 5:30, and stopping fighting this fact was the smartest thing I did in year one. Exercise, breakfast, a list of projects, a designated afternoon activity, dinner. I executed this structure with complete consistency, and underneath the execution, Patty told me in month 7, she could see that something wasn't working. She said, "You're running a mission where the objective is not being miserable. You're hitting all your metrics and it's not working." I didn't answer her immediately. I thought about it for 3 days, because she was right. And being right about something uncomfortable does not mean you know what to do about it immediately. Here is what Patty had named that I had not been able to name for myself. The structure was real. The discipline was real. The execution was real. But the reason for the execution was wrong. For 44 years, everything I did had consequence outside myself. The readiness of my soldiers, the response capacity of a county in an emergency, real people in real situations that required a real and specific response from me. The work mattered in a way that was verifiable and external. When it mattered, I knew it mattered because I could see the consequence. In retirement, the projects I was doing mattered to no one except myself. And I had not yet learned, had not even begun to learn, how to be sufficient justification for my own work. How to do something because I wanted to, because it interested me, because it was mine, without needing the external confirmation that it was real. 44 years of external consequence had not prepared me for that. The rule of 55 could give me the financial window. It could not give me that. This is the thing. This is the thing I want to say as clearly as I can. The provision is real. The math is real. If it applies to your situation, it is a legitimate and useful option, and there is nothing wrong with using it. I used it. I do not regret using it. But the permission the provision gives you is financial permission. It tells you that you can access your funds without penalty. It tells you that the numbers can work. What it does not tell you, what no financial instrument can tell you, is what you are going to do with the room you just walked into. Not what activities you will fill it with. What the room is actually for. Who you are in it. What the work of that room looks like when there is no external standard to measure yourself against. No formation. No emergency response protocol. No quarterly review. Just you and the room and the time and the question of what you are going to make of it. That question is the one I was not prepared for. Not because I was careless. I had been a senior NCO for 2 decades. I was not a careless person. I was not prepared because no one had told me that this question existed. Everything about the transition process, the financial planning, the healthcare planning, the benefits navigation, is oriented toward the question of whether you can afford to leave. Almost nothing is oriented toward the question of who you are after you leave. And those are not the same question. They are not even close to the same question. I want you to stop with me for a moment. The provision let me leave. It didn't tell me what I was leaving for. That part is on you. I mean that as precisely as it sounds. Not as a warning, not as a discouragement, as the honest account of what leaving actually contains. The finances are the foundation. You need the foundation. You cannot build anything without the foundation. But the foundation is not the building. The building is what you construct on top of it. And the building is made of something that no spreadsheet can measure. 2 years into this retirement, the real one, the one I am actually living now rather than deferring, I have found the closest thing I have to a mission with external consequence at Fort Liberty, sitting with men who are exactly where I was. I have found something like presence at the Cape Fear River 2 or 3 mornings a week, fishing not because I love fishing, but because it requires enough attention to quiet the part of my mind that is always scanning for the next objective. I have found, slowly and with difficulty, the beginning of an answer to the question of what the room is for. Not a complete answer, not a permanent answer, a working answer. A first sergeant from Fort Hood sent me a message 11 lines long that said, essentially, I thought it was just me. I have kept that message. I have not answered it. I do not know what I would say that would add to what he already understands. But I keep it because it tells me why this channel exists. Because the thing he thought was just him is not just him. It is not just me. It is the specific condition of a man who spent a career inside a total institution and is now standing on the outside of it trying to remember who he is when no one is giving him a grade. The rule of 55 opens the door. I am telling you that the door is worth walking through when the time is right. I am also telling you that the work starts on the other side. Not financial work, human work. The particular work of learning that you are sufficient justification for the things you choose to do. That you do not need a mission externally assigned to make your presence in a room legitimate. That the room is yours. That is the hardest retraining of my life, and I am still in it. This week, not next month, this week, I want you to write down one sentence, not about whether the provision applies to you, not about the math. One sentence about what you picture when you picture yourself in early retirement on an ordinary Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. Not traveling, not a project, an ordinary Tuesday. What's in the room? Who's in the room? What you are doing and why it feels like enough. If the sentence comes easily, that tells you something. If you sit there and the sentence doesn't come, that tells you something too. Either way, that sentence, or the absence of it, is the actual work. The work the provision doesn't cover. I want to know what's in your picture. In the comments, tell me what you see when you picture an ordinary Tuesday in early retirement. Not the vacation version, the real Tuesday, the one that isn't special. Because how you picture the ordinary Tuesday is how you picture your life. And I want to know what's actually there for you. I read every comment on this channel, I mean that. If what you heard today felt like something you've been trying to name, I'd ask you to subscribe. Not for the count, because the comments section of this channel has become one of the most honest places I know. Veterans, first responders, people who built careers and are now in the middle of figuring out what comes after. People who are doing the work. Hit the bell so you're there when the next conversation happens. The provision is real. Use it if it applies to you. Just go in with your eyes open. The finances are the foundation. The life is what you build on top of it.